Welcome to another episode of Hot Track RC. Today we're going to do a full carbon fiber upgrade on this Yokomo YZ-10. Then we'll install some softer front springs and adjust ride height. We'll add some electronic motor timing to get this buggy zipping down the straights. And then we'll take the whole thing back to the track to see how the upgrades perform. So stick around! Last time we ran the YZ-10 at the track and we discovered some interesting issues with this car. First of all, we broke both the front and the rear shock towers. So that led us to invest in a complete carbon fiber upgrade kit for the car. This is from Extreme Racing and it's a pretty cool setup. These are not all the same carbon fiber grades. There are at least 4 different thicknesses of carbon fiber going on here. The shock towers are the thickest, which is what you would want. The chassis is the next thickest. The top deck is a little thinner than that. And the chassis stiffener is the thinnest. So somebody thought this through and came up with what they thought were the ideal stiffnesses for each of these parts. So looking forward to seeing how that performs. We also discovered some issues with the springs, which we knew going in. I was unable to get softer front springs for the last time out at the track. So we ran the stock springs. And then in the back, we had these NOS springs, ZB14Ss. And they are definitely softer than the stock and worked pretty well. But we had stiff in the front, hard in the back. No, we had stiff in the front and soft in the back. So now I've been able to source springs for both front and back that are softer. And this kind of is the overall story of these springs. I went through and did the analysis on these. So really the bottom line are the spring rates and how much softer the aftermarket springs are to the originals. And so on the fronts, I was able to find some that are about 32% lower on the spring rate than the stock. And on the rear, we've got the OEM aftermarket, or the OEM soft springs that we ran last time. Those are 30% less. And we've got a new set here, these, which are 38% less. They're also 2 millimeters shorter. That might be a good thing because I was having trouble getting the ride height correct. With the rear still wanting to sit a little too high. So we'll mix and match and figure out what the best combo is. But hoping to get it to really stick to the carpet better and not bounce around the track. And then the last thing was I was a little disappointed with the speed of the car down the straightaway. Well, if you recall, we put in this Hobby Wing XR10 ESC. And I already had this OTA programmer for Hobby Wing. And if you don't have one of these and you're running Hobby Wing ESCs, I definitely recommend it. So we'll plug this into the ESC, and that's going to allow us to tap into a whole host of performance options for the motor and ESC combo. And we should be able to dial up the electronic speed or the electronic timing for the motor and really dial in some more horsepower. So, let's get at it. In my mind, I thought this would be a quick teardown and chassis swap, but as you'll see, there's not much on this car that goes untouched. When I started off, I was just dumping all my screws into a pile, but it's a lot easier later on if you keep them organized. There's button head and flathead screws of different lengths that all have to go back in the right spot. This is a beautiful looking chassis. The servo has that one tricky screw coming in on the side of the chassis stiffener. Don't forget about that one. I felt kind of bad having to take this top deck off the car so fast after I just got it, but gotta upgrade to the carbon fiber. There's one other advantage to the new top deck other than being carbon fiber. The design's a little better, so we'll check that out in a minute. We're going to take the electronics out as a unit, no soldering. The best way I've found to break the servo tape on these components is to twist them. If that doesn't work, you have to fall back on fishing line and work it underneath. Taking the wheels off always feels like progress, so got that done. Now we'll pop out the motor, and then the ESC comes along with, and we're down to the bulkheads. The chassis stiffener ties the transmission housing to the chassis, so we got to deal with that. There's a lot of screws hanging on this chassis stiffener. It would have been smart to take the screw out of the transmission support there. The bell cranks have to be completely disassembled since they're built right onto the chassis. That pile of screws is growing in front of me on the table. I need to get a better plan going for that. Notice the reliefs on the side of this factory chassis where the suspension arms sit. Here's an additional project for the build that I wasn't expecting. The diffs are leaking, so that's going to have to be addressed. Front and back. At this point in the teardown, I started to put screws back in the holes they came from. It's a good practice, makes it a lot easier to find stuff in the end, but it does take a little extra time. I think it's worth it. And here's one of our shock towers that broke in the first track run. That's what's driving all of this effort. I was getting antsy to put something together by this time, so I decided to put some hardware on the new shock towers. Notice that they have more mounting points than the old towers. So I lined them up and chose the same locations that the kit suggested, and we can adjust from there. Back to teardown. Time to take apart the rear end, and we're getting to our other broken shock tower. I'm sure that the front and the rear towers did not break on the same impact, so that meant I was driving for a while with a compromised suspension system. Again, matching up the hole locations here and putting the hardware back on right away. Good way not to lose anything. Put the nuts on there to cap it off. All right, let's tear into these diffs. And nitrile gloves are kind of handy. This comes apart easy enough. Small needle nose pliers are super handy to get the pins out, and I really like having a pick set to pop the O-rings out. Just be careful that you don't puncture anything or tear anything. Be gentle. The gaskets appear to be hard to get, so I wasn't able to source any in time for this build, and I'm being very careful when I'm removing it not to tear the gasket. And I'm not going to clean all of these components up because I'm going to put them right back in. And this diff fluid is almost brand new. So I'm just going to worry about the housings. We're going to do two things to try to keep these diffs from leaking. One is we're going to sand the face of the diff flat. And we're going to use some seal grease on the gasket. Here you can see the ejector pin marks from the molding process. And that surface is not as flat as you would want. We're going to see that in a moment. When you pull this off the sandpaper, you see just the high points are getting hit. We're starting with 400 grit paper, and we'll move up to 600 and finally 800 to get a nice smooth finish. I don't recommend starting with something coarser than 400. If you go too far on this, the depth of engagement will decrease and you won't actually compress the gasket against the cap. You're done when the whole gasket face has the same even surface finish. This looks good right here. That's what we want to see. So let's put it back together. This time I got some Yokomo seal grease. I'm going to use this on the O-rings as well as the gasket. I noticed that the O-rings were getting a little tight. I hadn't used any oil or grease on those the first time I built these diffs. I'm dabbing the O-rings into the grease and working it around with my fingers a bit. And then onto the shaft. I can already tell the difference when I spin that. It's nice and smooth now. Remember when you go to put this pin back in that there's one location that has a slot in it that'll allow the pin to retract back far enough to get started. And there it goes. And everything else pretty much drops into place without too much trouble. I'm really hoping that these are nice and tight this time after the rebuild. But we'll have to see. Onto the caps here, same process. A little easier access to the pin when it comes time to slide that in. but the O-rings are the same on the housing and the cap. And now we'll put the large washer in and get that pin in place. Sometimes that pin likes to slide around a little bit when you're putting the bevel gear on, but you'll get it in the end. All right, now time for the gasket. I'm just going to work that grease around, make sure I have an even coating all the way around. I don't need it to be drenched because there's not much space in there, and that grease does take up space. As soon as I clamp this together, it's going to squeeze out just a little bit, and that's what I want. All right, time to fill. And I'm going back with the stock diff fluid for the front. So I'm going 5,000, and then I'm going to clamp this housing together. And with any luck, we'll have nice dry diffs. Tighten your screws in a cross pattern so you're working opposite sides of the cap on and evenly applying the force. That feels good. I think adding the grease to the O-rings is an improvement. And it looks dry so far. On a high traction surface, you can go with a lighter diff fluid in the rear to get better turn-in response. So we're going to use 3,000 and see how that does. I feel like we've done everything that we can on these diffs, so I'm optimistic. But time to put this car back together. Don't forget the bearings on the diff axles. Since these diffs have different fluid in them between the front and the rear, I'm marking them with an F and an R so I don't get them mixed up. Now remember that the stock chassis had suspension arm reliefs. I test fit the arms before I went and cut some reliefs into this carbon fiber chassis. And what I saw is that the arms just didn't pivot much below horizontal. Maybe that would work with the stock setup, but if you want to make adjustments and maybe get some more droop or what have you, I just didn't think there was enough clearance there, and the factory thought it needed them, so I added them only where there was interference. Because of the rake of the suspension arms, you only need the reliefs on the trailing edges, both front and rear. This isn't the last time we're going to do some modifications on these carbon fiber parts. Make sure that you have an N95 mask that fits well before you do this. This carbon fiber is kind of nasty and you don't want to breathe this stuff in. Whether you're drilling or grinding, it comes off in a really fine dust that can get through small cracks. So far, the bulkheads are going together like a dream. I'm doing way better than the last build with the Loctite usage, so hopefully everything's gonna stay in place. Here you can see the sag on the control arms, which to me looks about right. I don't think that I'll need to go any lower than that and should have clearance for my setup. I really don't want my control arms to have a hard stop that's the edge of the chassis. That just doesn't seem like a good idea. I did some work behind the scenes to figure out what screws went where before I started filming this. Otherwise, it would have taken a long time. So, stay organized and things will go smoother. I still don't understand why they went button head on the two transmission housing fasteners. And they had to make a little relief in the under tray for those as well. Alright, here we go on the chassis stiffener. This looks like a really simple part, and I can't imagine what could go wrong with it. And yet, as you'll see, we spent a lot of time on this part, and some time that I didn't get on film, trying to make this fit just right. You may be asking, why are you putting those supports on the chassis stiffener instead of onto the chassis first and then mounting the stiffener to that? Well, that's because originally I put the rear bulkhead in the front, and there wasn't access to get to the front screw. So this is a ripple effect from making a mistake the first time. Now, one thing I like to do here is to put the screw in without Loctite to hold a component in place, and then put the other screws in with Loctite, and then go back and Loctite the others, because it's just kind of messy when you're trying to use Loctite and something's sliding around on you. Here we have a problem. The screw will not go through the hole in the chassis stiffener from the transmission housing. What to do? Well, I had to elongate that hole. This took me several attempts to get it to fit just right. There's no adjustment. The front of the chassis stiffener is mounted on countersunk screws, so you can't slide it around. Everything else is as well for the most part. So I just didn't see any alternative other than to slot that hole. It's not that surprising that there could be a misalignment with so many components that each have tolerance. You've got tolerance stack up that occurs and they just don't line up. The factory version of the top deck had slots in the rear, probably for that reason. Now here I'm feeling and hearing some rubbing, and I'm trying to figure out what it is. I think that it's the screw on the chassis stiffener that is countersunk. It comes really close to the belt and looks like it's rubbing. And it could be countersunk deeper, so I did that. But you can't go too deep because the edge is really thin there. So now I put it back together and I still have interference. So what is going on? It's okay without the front belt engaged. So it has to be something with the front bulkhead, the differential, and I can hear it and I can almost see it, and there it is. It's the chassis stiffener rubbing on the flange of the differential. And that is definitely our problem. Now you might say, Bob, you've got the chassis stiffener in the wrong place. That's why you had to slot that back hole. Actually, that moved it rearward and made the problem better. The issue is that the new chassis stiffener sticks out further than the old one. So I ground that out, and now they match. And with any luck, there won't be any problem. And sure enough, we've got clearance. Everything's smooth now, and I'm happy as a clam. It's this kind of attention to detail that will make your car run smooth and perform on the track the way you want. All right, on to the shock towers. This is where things get exciting, and I was so happy to be able to get rid of those broken ones. Now, here's something that's nice. On this new top deck, it has a cutout so that you can run the belt tensioner. So now we can put this back on after we had to take it off. And here's the rear shock tower. But look, I forgot to put the sway bar under the cap. So off that comes, back in, and we'll screw on our shock tower. And now we're starting to look like a car again. I'm liking the look of this carbon fiber. It's a little bit more of a light gray color than some I've seen, but it's definitely looking good. All right, time for our camber links. And I did have my screws in the joints, so they were easy to find. And I'll tighten those down and on to the next. Of course, we'll have to do a full setup on the car when we're done. There's no expectation that the camber settings will be correct after changing out all these major components. But they look good. Let's put the bell crank back together. Let me see if I can remember how this goes. You gotta remember which side the long and the short posts go on. The long one is on driver's side. Short post is on passenger side. And that kind of makes sense since the driver's side is the master. Let's get these nice and tight. This is something you definitely want to use Loctite on. Now the linkage, of course, I left together. I'll slide it under the belt. And I need a bushing for the passenger side. But, what have I forgotten? You got to put a washer under the bushing, then the bushing, and then another washer on top. But there are no washers that go on the driver's side, just the nut. And now that I get both nuts on, we should be good to go. Now we can attach the steering linkage. And of course, again, that will need to be checked for adjustment after we get everything set up. The factory springs have ground ends, and my aftermarket springs do not, which makes it possible to tell them apart. And I'm switching everything to the aftermarket soft springs. Remember, the rears are a little bit shorter, so I had to add a little more compression on those for kind of a baseline setting. So let's throw those shocks on the car, and at some point we'll be able to check ride height. The spring compression force definitely seems more appropriate than the factory springs. I highly recommend switching those out if you're going to do carpet track racing. Here's another mystery of this car. Why 3 screws on this servo mount? I think it's because the front screw is shorter and it must have pulled out at some point in racing, so they threw another screw on, but kind of unusual to have 3 instead of 2 on a single bracket like that. Now we got to get that tricky little side fastener into the chassis stiffener, tighten everything up, and we should be good. We'll pop the linkage back on the servo arm, and now we can give her a try. That looks good. That's kind of mesmerizing. On to the next step, which is one of my favorites, putting the top deck on. And here you see that cutout for the belt tensioner. Also, I countersunk the front screw holes. Why'd I do that? Because the button head fasteners that come with the kit interfere with the body, and you're supposed to drill 2 holes in the body to provide clearance for those, which I didn't want to do. And honestly, I think the countersunk lock the top deck in place even better than the button heads. Oh, this is really looking good now. I just love that top deck. I don't know what it is, but I'm a big fan. But what am I doing? I'm taking it off already because in my haste to get the enjoyment of installing that, I forgot to put the new servo bracket on. And here I go, but it's not threading in. Why is it not threading in? Well, the holes aren't lining up. Why are the holes not lining up? Well, because there's almost 0 clearance between the fastener and the hole. So if they're not exactly aligned with the servo mount, the thread's not going to start. So what to do? Well, what I should have done was go back and go up 1 machinist drill bit size, and then everything would have gone together really easily, but I was tired of modifying carbon fiber at this point, so I just kept trying, and I risked stripping out my servo mount, but I did get it here by pulling the servo mount away as much as I could so that I could kind of tilt the fastener in and get it to start. Really not the best practice. If you need to add a little space, get a bigger drill bit. Now we're getting to some of the details like the battery cups. And no problem with these, they go right on. The kit replaces the plastic top strap with a nice carbon fiber one. And by the way, it has holes in it so that you can get to your balance plug in your battery, which is kind of nice. The old one you had to remove. Of course, you could just drill a hole in it. All right, here we go with the motor ESC assembly. I've already got the servo tape on the bottom of the ESC. I want to get that sideways like that. All right, happy with that. Route some wires, and now just my 2 fasteners to retain the motor. Got to set my gear mesh here, but this is really going together easily. And even as I put that together, the mesh just fell into place. All right, a couple tie wraps to keep my wiring from getting into gears and belt tensioners and other things. Make sure you don't tie wrap your belt. Cut everything, and now we just need to put a receiver in. Depending on the connector style that you have, they may or may not obviously be keyed to the polarity, so pay attention to that. All right. And wow, look at this. We've got wiring in our car. Time to put the under tray on. No sweat there. Looks good. I like it clear so I can see that carbon fiber. Now we'll put on our wheels and tires. I won't bore you with the details on that. And wow, we have a completed car. Time for a power up. Everything looks good there, just the way I left it. All right, now we're going to plug in our OTA programmer and see if we can dial in some speed to this car. Just download the app from Android or Apple, and we can connect up using Bluetooth. We'll search for the right name, which is Bob RC, and the super secret password 88888. And here we are. All the settings are at our disposal. We've got some handy stuff like setting reverse or brake only. We've got brake control settings, but what's this? I don't see any timing options. Nothing about timing at all. So let's take a look at my B6.4 that's running the XR10 Pro, which is what I was familiar with. So we'll plug in the OTA on that and get it powered up. Whoa, listen to that fan. That's why I don't like fans in my vintage cars. Let's turn that down, please. Okay, that's better. All right, so here is the control panel for the B6.4 running the XR10 Pro. And here you can see there's a few extra controls, but in particular, there's a whole section on timing. So silly me, I didn't realize that the standard XR10 does not offer timing. Here I have boost and turbo timing. Boost is for lower RPM. You can have it kick in when you want. Turbo is for top speed, and I have that tweaked on this car. So we're going to have to fall back on mechanical motor timing. We're going to tweak this baby and get the maximum performance we can.
It's not exactly street legal.
Actually, Hank, this is totally legal for stock class racing. Electronic motor timing is not legal, so in a way, this is a better way to go. Okay, we're going to bump it up to 40 degrees. The sweet spot is between 35 and 45. Of course, you can use a motor analyzer to dial in quicker. Time to check ride height and see where we are with these soft springs. The rear's at 19 millimeter, front's at about 17, so we're going to have to take the front up because I don't have any way to get the rear lower. So now we're getting closer. It's like 18. We're still at around 19 for the rear. Yeah. And let's see how she bounces. And luckily doesn't bounce. I think I like the Yokomo soft rear springs better. It just seems like they're a little stiffer, but I still get the same ride height. So I think that's going to be better for the carpet track. And I got the same 19 millimeter height in the back, and I got 19 going on in the front. Here we go. I like that. That looks good. All right, let's weigh this. We were at 1442, and off to the track. Last time I drove this car before the conversion, I found myself fighting with it a bit. It was bouncy over the jumps, the handling wasn't where I wanted it, and the speed down the straight was a little lackluster. But that looks good. I am happy with that. Car's landing well, and I feel like it's cornering better too. Probably those softer front springs are making the car balanced. And of course we changed out the diff fluid also. It's cornering pretty well. Let's see how we do this time around. And yeah, now that was a little nose forward, and it didn't cause any problems. So that was looking good. Speed down the straight's a little better. We could probably tweak the motor to 45 degree timing as long as we're not getting too much heat. I don't see any issue with acceleration. Oh, that looked good. So haven't lost too much low end torque. So the cornering's good. A little bobble there, but no problem. And yeah, I mean, I think I could definitely get into driving this car. This is a lot more enjoyable than last time out. Let's see how we do this time. Nice. Here we go again. And this little jump doesn't take much to get over, but the tabletop is fun. That was nice, right in the middle of the downslope. And good little section in the middle there. All right, I'm liking this. Everything's going well. Car's just responding, and it's not hard to drive now. It was hard to drive the last time. Another nice jump. A little nose high over that first double. Again, didn't present any problems for the car. And zipping down the straight around the cinnamon roll. Here we go. Clip the edge just a tad there. All right. Yeah, it's really driving nicely. I'm happy with this. I wasn't sure the first time out with this car whether I could do vintage racing with it, but now I'm definitely saying yes. And I think there's more to get out of the car, obviously. I mean, these YZ-10s had a storied history, and what you can achieve with these cars is pretty impressive. I've seen people on the track, even recently, with, like 91, 93 Works cars that are tricked out, and they perform really well. However, there's nothing the car can do about driver error, as in this case. Normally, when you go over the tabletop, you give it some brake to rotate and land it. This car, if you give it any brake, you're nose diving. That was a mistake. Here I'm power on. The ESC is getting a little hot to the touch after a long run with the advanced timing, so it could benefit from the fan, which I hadn't put on, but that's back in the box, so we could add that on easily. Getting in some good lap time on this car without having to do too many repairs or setup changes, so I'm really happy about that. But there's that driver error again. Ouch. Somebody else had a little error. And now I'm noticing something doesn't seem right. Is it just me? This car does not seem to be handling right. Okay, what's going on here? Well, keep driving it a little bit. No, something is wrong. So we lost one of the spring cups. As you can see, this spring is retained, this spring is not. That is a problem. So this suspension was not working the last lap. So we're gonna go searching for that, or we're gonna need to find another one. Luckily, a nice lady at the track found our spring cup and we're back in business. This car is so much fun to jump now. I just want to do it again and again. It's very consistent, as long as you're careful with the brake. This time I actually used brake right there to good effect. Most of the time though, you just stay on the throttle. Because if you use too much, that happens. That's a problem. And we caught it before either of the screws fell out completely, so that's good. Ooh, different problem. There. Use Loctite on your set screws. Both sides. Wow, one of the four wheels isn't falling off. Let's go for some long jumps. Bang. That's a little farther than you want. That's pretty much ideal. We've thrashed this car pretty hard, so time to try the triple. That one was up short. Let's try again. And long. Should have got on the brake that time. Oh, watch out for the traction roll. 19 millimeter. We made it through the whole session without breaking anything. So we lost a part temporarily. We found it again. We had all 3 of 4 wheels come completely loose and almost fall off. But we recovered and we're going home with a functional car.
I love it when a plan comes together.
What an awesome time out at the track. The car just performed beautifully, and the carbon fiber kit is gorgeous. For all the talk about having to do the modifications, I really didn't mind it, and we ended up with something I think that's kind of special. And it was stiff, it drove great, we didn't break anything, seemed really robust, so I'm very happy. You can seal the edges of your carbon fiber. I have not done that, and certainly didn't do it on this. There are so many edges on all these pieces that I couldn't bear to start on that. So I'm going to see what happens, and if I start having an issue somewhere, maybe I'll pull it off and do a repair or seal it up. So I think the kit is overall well designed. I really like the fact that the belt tensioner fits in it now, unlike the previous factory top deck. So 2 thumbs up. Springs made a big difference on this car. So I'll drop some links to where I got these springs on Amazon. Like I said, I did revert back to the Yokomo rear, and I haven't been able to find another set of those for sale anywhere, so I did mention the part number. Good luck on that. But I think that the soft springs that I found would work, so you can check those out. You saw at the end of the episode, we did have a little traction roll going on, and that's just the nature of being at 19 millimeter ride height. If we could get this down to maybe 16 millimeter, which I think is possible, it would definitely corner even faster and more aggressively. The front end with these soft springs is already down in that range, maybe 17. And the rears, we could probably mess around with the upper shock mounting points to get it down. We are going to lose some suspension travel, so that's the trade-off. But you'll be able to corner faster. And overall, that should make the car faster around the track and drop those lap times. I'm not sure what the best solution is on the wheel retention screws. If you use Loctite, it's going to just get crusty and flake off every time you're changing out the wheels. It will add some resistance, so maybe that's the best way to go. I haven't done that. If you don't use Loctite, you're going to need to check the torque on your screws often to make sure your wheels aren't falling off. On the hubs, you can definitely use Loctite on those. Get those nice and tight, get them adjusted. Don't do what I did where they came loose. I think that's a problem you can address. In other good news, the diffs did not leak. So I'm super happy about that. And one thing that did happen is the servo saver loosened up. I didn't show that in the video, but the nut on the bottom of the servo saver adjuster started to loosen up. The spring got loosed, and I lost most of my steering. So, you know, I brought it in. What's going on? It was pretty evident. Oh, you just have to tighten the nut back up. So watch out for that. You probably want to get it fairly snug when you start off and it doesn't loosen. Maybe you need to use some Loctite on that, but then you're not going to be able to adjust it easily. Honestly, with modern servos, with metal gears, you can have it pretty tight and you're not going to have an issue. The last thing that we haven't talked about is the wing that comes with this car. It looks great on the shelf. I'd recommend replacing it with a modern wing for the track. It's definitely the weak link, particularly with robustness in mind. When you flip it, it takes a lot of abuse and it's really not meant for that. So you are going to crack it after a while. I've started to get some stress cracks around the tips of the wing. So I think it's awesome. Paint it up, maybe get a different wing and mount it up for race day, and then you should be good to go. So that's it for the YZ-10 series. There is more that could be done, but it's time to move on to other things. We got to get the RC10T built. So, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.